So, the landscape on energy and the environment is going to shift dramatically over the next 4 years. We not only have a Congress that's going to go out and it'll be of the same party as the president, but I think that both the congressional majority and President Trump are going to be in favor of reining in what they call regulatory overreach at the agencies, including the Environmental Protection Agency. They're going to make sure that regulations that get promulgated pursuant to statutory authority, and they're going to argue that the free market is really the generator of wealth and prosperity and rising living standards. And that one of the main functions of government should be to remove political barriers to wealth creation. They want to remove barriers to entrepreneurship, and that includes ignoring the costs of pollution externalities. You could look at this as calling it lifting the rocks so the grass can grow. Now, President-elect Trump's pick to head EPA is Oklahoma Attorney General Scott Pruitt. Pruitt has led the charge against EPA's Clean Power Plan. It's expected that he's going to work to undo the Clean Power Plan. The endangerment finding is still at play, though, and Pruitt Environmental Protection Agency is going to have to navigate that very carefully. It's not really going to be an urgent priority for the administration. It might be a really long-term priority. The endangerment finding was in a lawsuit that included the Massachusetts versus EPA back in 2007. And in that, the Supreme Court held that greenhouse gases are pollutants under the Clean Air Act. The court also rejected a laundry list of other reasons for inaction that had been pushed forward by the Bush administration. They said it was not consistent with the relevant parts of the Clean Air Act, and those require regulation when the Environmental Protection Agency finds that emissions of a pollutant endanger public health or welfare. Back in 2009, the Environmental Protection Agency determined, based on a careful review of the scientific record, that greenhouse gas emissions endanger the public health and welfare of current and future generations, both in America and globally. This is an action that the DC Circuit Court upheld in a following ruling. So, back to the Trump administration. There are a lot of other kinds of environmental reforms that would take care of and address the endangerment finding that the Trump administration might be concerned about. And this is going to be a lot easier to accomplish than actually reversing this rule through rulemaking. One of these is going to be like a congressional fix, where simply legislation that would redefine the 1970 Clean Air Act, you could say that it didn't authorize the EPA to make climate policy for the entire nation. Eventually, Congress could get around to the endangerment finding. You could discuss this. So if Trump shuts down the Clean Power Plan, and there'd be a number of other regulations that are in the pipeline that also could be addressed. Say, you could use congressional review, and the Congressional Review Act can be used to slow down the Environmental Protection Agency. So I don't think this is something they're really going to try to do right out of the box. You know, a strategist for Trump could say, don't do this first, do some other things first. You could upend the Clean Power Plan, and that's something that you can accomplish in a bunch of different ways. So Congress plays a big part in this. Congress could defund any enforcement action on the Clean Power Plan. So that's already been suspended in the Clean Power Plan has already been suspended by the Supreme Court in some ways. It's been stayed. But EPA has been doing a lot of work with the Clean Power Plan in spite of that. So you have a lot of sort of different actions that the EPA, and you can restrict these actions through Congress. Congress would essentially have to change the Clean Air Act, and that's kind of a super long shot. Overturning the endangerment finding is also a long shot through rulemaking processes. The Trump administration itself has to really get to the root of what the EPA has been doing under President Obama. It's pretty clear that even if the greenhouse gas endangerment finding is kept, you can still get rid of the Clean Power Plan. That's what you might want to pay attention to as things go forward in the future. So, if Trump takes away the Clean Power Plan, it has to be replaced with something. And you have to do that so that the United States can meet the requirements of the Paris Agreement on greenhouse gas emissions. So basically, what the Trump administration could decide, what Trump's EPA could decide through rulemaking, is that the only actions that EPA is authorized to do under it's called Section 111D of the Clean Air Act, what those actions are the only ones that can be affordably implemented within the fence lines of regulated facilities, like coal power plants. And so that would effectively limit the Clean Power Plant to simply asking utility companies and power plants very nicely to become a little bit more efficient a little bit every year. If the United States tries to exit the Paris Agreement to slow climate change, there are a bunch of different ways to do this. Some of these are complementary and work together. Under terms of the Paris Agreement, a party or a country can withdraw if it submits a notification of withdrawal 3 years after the agreement goes into effect, which was recent. So then the notification itself becomes effective a year after that. That's like 4 years. So now that's not ideal if you're President Trump, because that means that under the first 4 years, basically, of Trump's term, the United States is going to be a party to the Paris Agreement. The more dramatic way to address this would be to submit a notification of withdrawal to the parent treaty, the Paris Agreements, and the Paris Agreement's parent is the Framework Convention on Climate Change. And now, because we're like way past that 3-year effective deadline, that would mean it would become effective in 1 year. Now, the big move is for Trump to exit by going through diplomatic formalities. But Trump has a backup. He can also engage the Senate, and the Senate can object to the Paris Agreement by saying it was like a deliberate strategy to cut the Senate out of treaty making. Now, under Article Section 2, that gives the Senate a little bit of power here, even if the executive branch did something different. The argument is kind of like the Senate has nothing to say about it, and the Senate also has nothing to say about whether it should be engaged. That the Paris Agreement is simply a unilateral judgment that the executive branch or the president got to make. You know, is it a treaty? Is it not a treaty? This non-treaty is something to you. The Senate can't really say anything about it. So the Republican Party, the GOP, can back out of having Trump to submit the Paris Agreement to the Senate, and it can ask the Senate for advice and consent. And the Senate's going to have problems with this. The Senate typically has a different view on these agreements. So that means that Trump wouldn't have to make a decision on his own. It would be up to the Senate and the party that controls the Senate. So their diplomatic considerations are in play too. If you want to exit the Paris Agreement, it's going to have some negative ramifications internationally. And that's going to affect developing countries. A really big part of the Paris Agreement was working to get the developing world, in some cases, to help those developing countries leapfrog technology problems and help them with adapting to climate change and how they can mitigate or reduce the impacts of climate change. So developing countries are a big part of the Paris Agreement. Trump's administration basically say it's really hard to put your foot on the accelerator and the brake at the same time to accomplish anything useful by trying to grow developing countries and by trying to slow down emissions from developed countries like America. So what the Paris Agreement has to say about this when you're talking about leapfrogging technology, it's asking the world to somehow ensure that countries that have little to no modern energy all of a sudden become energy, or maybe by 2050 they're going to become energy rich enough so that they have enough wealth to conquer poverty and to grow their economies. But at the same time, they'd have to abandon all of the energy technologies that have really brought the rest of the developed world into the modern era. And we got our wealth in America from these energy-rich technologies. It's a high-risk project. Trump is going to argue that it's basically putting an energy-starved world on an energy diet, and that's going to slow growth. In the Senate, there's some work that's going on for the 115th Congress, and that's something to pay attention to, who is controlling the Environment and Public Works Committee. And at the top of the agenda, Congress could be trying to roll back some regulations that they say will inhibit job growth and energy use. So the overall approach is you can either say that there are costs to pollution and costs to sea level rise, or you can say that property rights and limited government are the better way to promote the health and welfare of the American people and the world in general. If you decide to focus on jobs and things, Trump could try to go ahead and defund something like the United Nations Framework on Climate Change. That's not a treaty, it's just a UN agency. In March of this year, the Framework Convention agency recognized Palestine as a state. Under existing United States law, if a United Nations body recognizes a non-state actor as a state, the United States can try to cut off funds to that specific agency. So stay tuned. There are a lot of things in play and things that are going on. While Trump isn't likely to go ahead and unilaterally pull anything out,